Hi, my name is Alex Williams, founder of The New Stack, and you're listening to the New Stack Analyst Podcast, a show about application development and management at scale. Thanks for joining us. Hey, it's Alex Williams of The New Stack here today for an episode of The New Stack Analyst, and joined by Joab Jackson, Managing Editor at The New Stack. Hey, Joab.
Aloha.
And joining us today are Brian Gracely and Jesse White. Hi, guys. How are you?
Hey, Alex. Doing well.
Brian, can you just tell us about... Hey, guys. Hey, Brian, why don't you just tell us about who you are and what you're doing now at Red Hat, and then Jesse, then you can chime in.
Yeah, sure. Thanks again for having me on. This is Brian Gracely. I'm Director of Product Strategy for the Openshift product at Red Hat, primarily focused on helping customers get their applications onto container platforms and start building applications faster.
And my name is Jesse White. I'm principal at Contino. We're a DevOps, container, and cloud-focused consultancy here in New York City. Our main goal is to help large enterprises understand how they can leverage technology, move more quickly, and understanding the ever-changing technology landscape.
Excellent. Okay, so one of the things that we're interested in doing here with this program is helping analyze the landscape as best we possibly can, and we thought that it might be useful for us to take us back to Dockercon this past summer, when Solomon Hykes was talking about how Docker Swarm would be integrated into Docker Engine. And so I know, Joab, you have a recording and a summary of the recording, and perhaps you could then give us some context here.
Certainly. And we'll splice it in at some point early on. But yeah, listening to that talk now, it's Solomon Hykes did the first day opening keynote where he introduced the idea of incorporating Docker Swarm, the orchestration engine, into the Docker container engine itself. And it seems like they obviously put a lot of thought into the keynote because they anticipated maybe some of the resistance. You can tell that listening to it now. But basically, yeah, Solomon kicked off by saying he'd reminded the audience what made Docker a success to begin with, and that was ease of use. And he had pointed out that the best technologies don't come from some unifying vision to build a perfect platform to answer every need, but rather the best technologies come about as simple tools that basically solve a problem in a fundamentally easy way. And so the interesting thing that when he gone on to talk about Docker, incorporating Docker Swarm, he likened the current orchestration scene to what containers themselves were prior to Docker. I mean, it was possible to do containers. Lots of companies were doing them and offering them. It was really Docker that brought them to the developers because of their ease of use. And so the argument he was making about incorporating Docker Swarm was basically one of we don't need an overarching platform to just another thing that administrators will have to manage, and it's going to be difficult to manage and operate. And most companies don't have the manpower, to handle something like, say, Kubernetes or Mesos. And so the idea behind Docker Swarm was to embed it right into the container engine. And in fact, the only people who really understand how a microservices-based application should be orchestrated are the developers. So why shouldn't the developers be in charge of the orchestration process? And since then, of course, there's been a lot of you talk from the orchestration camps about Kubernetes, in particular about we need to the base of focus for containers shouldn't be containers themselves, but the orchestration tool. And so that's where we're at. But it's interesting to go back and listen to some of Heike's comments early on.
The problem with orchestration is that the technology is solved. It's completely solved. Actually, it's been solved for a long time, but it's only usable by experts. Only experts can use it. And that leaves the rest of us with basically two options. Option number one, hire an army of experts to take care of it for you. There are many of those experts here in this room. Less scary. And your army of experts will install, configure, manage, scale, operate all of the moving pieces, all of the systems needed to get a full-blown orchestration system. The problem is that not everyone can afford an army of experts. And even if you can, it's not necessarily the best use of your resources, because those are resources you will not be investing in differentiating your business. The other option is to rely on another company with their own army of experts to take care of everything for you magically in exchange for getting all of your hardware, all of your services, all of your support, all of your software from them forever. And we call that lock-in. So these are the two options. And what a lot of you have told us is that these are not really great options. And it would be cool if there was a third option. So starting with Docker 112, we're embedding a whole suite of orchestration features out of the box to make orchestration usable by every single Docker user right away. We're very, very excited about this. We worked really hard on it. A lot of people helped us along the way and tried it out. There's a lot.
Brian, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think the entire industry owes Solomon and his team a huge sort of debt of gratitude. They did an amazing job taking a technology that's been around for a while, right? Containers and C groups and namespaces have been around for 10 years in the Linux kernel, and did a really good job of marrying this business need, which is lots and lots of companies who want to build applications that are much more flexible. They want to get them deployed faster. They did an awesome job in terms of making that very, very simple. And I think Docker does a very good job of kind of holding the whole industry accountable for making sure that this technology that we build, or these things that we build in communities, doesn't get complicated, right? The last thing we want is businesses that want to be able to go faster, build software faster, get burdened with a bunch of tools that are impossible to use. So I think we owe them all a debt of gratitude in terms of showing what's possible. I think on the flip side of it, I don't know that I totally agree with his statement that the best tools out there or successful things have been built, have never been built by committees. I think you can sort of point to a few things that some people are aware of, things like the Android operating system, which owns 80% of the smartphone market, is essentially community driven and built by a lot of different people. That little thing called the internet was created by a committee of people. It's regulated by the IETF. It gets iterated on. Everybody on the planet uses it. So I think those sort of very broad statements that are kind of specific to your product. I don't know that those necessarily play out when we look at how big and how successful a lot of these community-driven projects are, in the marketplace.
Yeah, another example of that is, there's UNIX, which actually is a combination of both lots of very useful tools, but also an overall architecture that turned out to be very robust. So, yes.
Yep. Yeah, and I think being a Linux company, we very much as Red Hat, we very much subscribe to the idea that the Linux philosophy, the Unix philosophy of building small independent tools that can operate, do valuable things independently, and then work very well with other things is a great philosophy. I think we subscribe to it. Our customers subscribe to it. So we would love to see the container community continue to embrace that belief that we should see independent tools that can be used in the best way possible, and then work with other tools where necessary.
So Jesse, what's your take?
Yeah, I think those are all great points. And having listened to the keynote several times, there's a few things I'm left with. One, I totally agree that Solomon and company have helped us usher in an era of comfortableness with some of these tools and expectations that they be easy to use and open to contributors. So I'm really glad to see that period of time coming to something of an end. And what we're seeing now, in my opinion, is the natural breakpoint of where most companies are in agreement that either a public, private, or hybrid cloud platform of some sort is needed. Certain organizations are going to have higher requirements in terms of more standards compliant solutions. Others are going to want to move faster. So really what I see, and I'm glad to see, is that we're moving beyond the question of, are these tools enterprise ready? Are these methodologies the right things to be thinking about? How much are we helping versus hindering developers and operations? And I think it's a good point to be at, where Solomon's got a company. He wants to sell a product. I'm glad to see him pushing his angle, because I think it's a complement to the other angles in Kubernetes and Red Hat. In the ecosystem we're seeing spring up around this need become more legitimized in the industry and accepted as a way of doing business and a way of leveraging technology. So, while I think that there's definitely an angle had by Solomon's use of the tool set, small Unix-based type tools, and it's opinionated, in my opinion, I think it's a good thing to provide an interesting counterbalance for an ecosystem that is really early in its evolution. And frankly, I spend more time in my day job worrying about people and process. So happy to let the technology continue to evolve with strong players that are opinionated with their process.
So Jesse, what do you think are the pros and cons of baking in Docker Swarm into the Docker engine?
When you bake in Docker Swarm in the engine, what I think happens is you start to buy into an ecosystem. It's the same worry people have when they go to Amazon or select Azure as their cloud provider. Back a few years ago, when I was approaching larger financial institutions, everyone was really scared about lock-in. And they had a lot of conversations internally and soul searching and said, do we buy into this ecosystem and lock ourselves in? Do we treat this cloud service provider as an enemy? How do we go to multi-CSP? And what I found was a lot of people spend a lot of time really burning up energy and time and money trying to defend themselves against lock-in. So I don't think, and I think this with Amazon or any other ecosystem, I think if you can decide which tool at the moment is best for your organization's skill set and their way of being, I think there's a risk to lock in, but whatever's going to get you to the finish line as quickly as possible at this point is what you should focus on. And Docker represents a specific version of that at this point, which is, as mentioned, relatively opinionated.
Excellent. Brian, I was wondering, let's step back a second. And could you explain what relationship OpenShift, Red Hat's OpenShift, has with Kubernetes? I've been describing it as kind of a commercial distribution of Kubernetes, but I'm sure that's not entirely correct. Could you talk a bit about what OpenShift is?
Yeah, no. So, your definition is actually very, very good. So just to put it into a little bit of context and historical context, I guess. So OpenShift got started back in 2011, was available in 2011. Back when there was sort of this huge fascination with PaaS platforms. So Heroku, Google App Engine, Cloud Foundry came out around the same time. And, like a lot of those other platforms, we were using containers as, under the covers. So if you push an application to OpenShift, just like if you push an application to any of the other ones, the thing that would run that ultimately was containers under the covers. And what we ultimately made a decision about 2.5 years ago was we said, essentially the same sort of decision that a lot of customers make. We were sort of doing a do-it-yourself version of a container scheduler, a container orchestrator, and we got wind that Google was going to open source Kubernetes. They were going to take all their expertise and make that open source. And so we, about 2.5 years ago, made a decision, and we said we're going to scrap the core engine of what's in OpenShift. We're going to replace that with Kubernetes, and we're going to make a big focus on our contributions around Kubernetes. So in essence, OpenShift today is a enterprise distribution of Kubernetes. And with that, we bake in a lot of the other things that you need just to operate containers. So, we bake in, networking, we bake in how you associate storage and data volumes, container registry, the UI, a bunch of those things that you're going to need to operate Kubernetes. But it's 100% a enterprise Kubernetes distribution at this point.
Terrific. Now, so the current user base of OpenShift, this is primarily operations or system administrators as opposed to developers?
We have sort of a mix of both. I think what we see is, so most of our customers for OpenShift, tend to be larger organizations. So banks, insurance, people like Airbus who make airplanes, Volvo who makes automobiles. And what they're doing, and I think OpenShift is a little bit different or a little bit unique in this is because it's container centric, it allows customers to either focus on, sort of new cloud native 12-factor types of applications, or we see a lot of customers who, want to use this highly automated platform to move some amount of existing applications, and they'll simply containerize them, move them onto the platform, picks up all this automation and highly availability. And so we see customers doing a mix of that. And so, the operators or the people that integrate with it or interact with it is a mix of developers and their operations teams.
One of the curious things about listening to Hike's talk is how he kept referring to developers. This will make life easy for developers. I'm not really sure. I mean, it seems like there might be two existing markets out there, developers and operations. And orchestration, I'm not sure where that would fall in the average enterprise.
Yeah, so I don't
out there.
Well, I'll give you this. I'll give you this as a data point. So I had a conversation with Derek Collison, who you guys all know really well, about a year ago, and we were talking about platforms and different things, and Derek said, I kind of had this epiphany because he'd been watching the Docker market and he'd been watching Kubernetes and Swarm and Mesos, and he said, it kind of finally dawned on me. He said, there's sort of a very distinct line. There's what Docker does, which is they do an awesome job of creating a developer experience, which is build your application however you want to, whatever language and framework you want, gives you a simple way to package it and a simple way to sort of push it and distribute it. And then there's sort of this line then in the sand between that experience, and you optimize around making that a great experience, and then the experience of actually running the application, running it in production, making sure that it's highly available. And so I think what we see is these platforms, whether it's, Docker and Docker Swarm and that ecosystem, or Kubernetes and OpenShift or Cloud Foundry, right? There's a part of it that's the developer experience. And then there's a part of it that you have to provide a great experience for the operators. Otherwise, any benefits you get for the developers kind of goes out the window because the application isn't stable and doesn't run and all that sort of stuff. So, I think a lot of us are all trying to be very good at hopefully delivering both those experiences.
Nice.
Let's take a quick break and get back to the show. Hi, my name is Alex Williams, founder of The New Stack, and you're listening to the New Stack Analyst Podcast. a show about application, development, and management at scale. Thanks for joining us. Now let's get back to the show.
Is Kubernetes as easy to use as Docker? I've had experience working with Docker, but I haven't worked with Kubernetes yet. Is it an easy application to learn how to manage?
Jesse?
Yeah. Well, I think it's the nuanced question, because Docker's explicit aim is the developer experience. So the answer at the surface is Docker clearly is easier to manage and develop for. You've also seen recent efforts with Kubernetes in developing a simple way to deploy it. There's been a recognition that it's kind of a bit of a hairball to get up and running. And so some really tremendous resources have been put into getting Kubernetes into a place where you can kube control up or minikube your way into a development environment in order to start using the platform in a timely fashion. Now, when it comes to administering it, I think if I were to rate it in terms of the learning per horsepower, I think Kubernetes overall provides a more comprehensive set of management tools and networking. So the net intellectual investment for Kubernetes may be higher, but it provides at this point more control and granularity than Docker does, which in my mind reflects the general ethos of Docker, doing a small set of things well, which doesn't require a lot of overhead. But that said, you get less flexibility than with the Kubernetes platform, and that's why I find going to a lot of meetup groups and talking with a lot of the developers or developer relations people and some of these enterprises, they found the pockets of shadow IT using the Docker ecosystem more frequently than Kubernetes. But I think as soon as Kubernetes gets that first stumbling block of easy provisioning and local development environments removed, which is in my opinion almost complete, you'll see a lot more experimentation on that platform.
So what is the what is the real division here in the community then when you compare Docker and Docker Swarm and Kubernetes, and what is the effect on long-term stability with Docker Swarm being integrated into Docker Engine? What's the concern there?
Well, in my opinion, it's a question of, is Kubernetes going to be able to almost downgrade its complexity and usability from a Google product to something that mere enterprises can use and smaller to medium companies can use? Or is Docker going to be able to continue to leverage a very rich and active contributor ecosystem? You'll see tons of security companies being formed in stealth right now and popping up all over the place to serve that ecosystem. Who's gonna succeed in either Docker leveraging their community and all of the third-party vendors to support that community to bring Swarm and Docker Data Center into the enterprise? Or are we going to see Google's Kubernetes be broadly adopted and simplified and made more effective for use by non-cutting-edge technology firms?
Brian, so you guys are firmly in the Kubernetes camp. What is your take on what Jesse says? And in particular, I'm curious about your guys' thinking on Docker Swarm inside Docker Engine, and how does that impact you, and how does that affect your view on long-term stability of the overall ecosystem?
Yeah, so I think Jesse's right on. I think I think first off, his assessment of kind of where Docker is in terms of simplicity and ease of use versus Kubernetes is right on. It's a simpler set of tools today to use. I think he's right. The Kubernetes group is trying to make it simpler. I think from our perspective in terms of the sort of Docker machine plus Docker swarm. So I was at Dockercon this past summer, as well as a lot of people. I think it brings up a couple of questions. The first one is, and whether customers care about this as much or not is to be determined. But, I feel like Docker needs to be very clear to their community in terms of where they're going with things, right? The ecosystem needs to know, where do I plug in? How can I plug in? Where are you going to build products versus where are you going to compete with me? And there's nothing wrong with that, all those sort of things, co-opetition and building systems and building tools and so forth. But I heard that quite a bit from people saying, we need that clarity. And I think if you compare that to where the Kubernetes community is, it's much clearer to people in terms of what is the community doing, where are there opportunities to do packaging and solutions exercises, where are there opportunities to interface and so forth. And, I think right now, if, the way I sort of explain it to people is, when you start tightly coupling some of these things, you create sort of a great day one experience for people. And that's really important because you don't want to create developer experience. But what does your, say, day 187 or day 226 look like when, you've got this code base that, is moving every month, every 2 months, isn't always necessarily transparent with the community when things are coming. What does your world look like at that point? Does it, we don't know what the scale characteristics and all look like. So, there's some very different philosophical things that are kind of at play here.
So the philosophical things in play do actually then relate back to the Docker approach. And are you mentioned that the Docker needs to be more clear. What would you like them to be more clear about?
Well, let's just take Swarm and Swarm Kit, right? That was something that wasn't sort of done behind the scenes. It's been well documented. There's been lots of Reddit threads about what's going on there. I think when you're going to make a change that significant, you need to communicate to people what's going on with it. You don't necessarily use your event. It gets into the thing that Kelsey Hightower brought up a few weeks ago or a month or so ago of if you're building a community, your community needs to know what's going on, and there needs to be some understanding of where you're going with things. And Swarm Kit may only be the only thing that ever comes out of this, and everything else tends to be independent tools. We'll see. But that's the type of stuff that if you're the ecosystem and the chief developer in a community decides to sort of change the architecture, you leave a lot of people sort of wondering what's next. How do I continue to do that? And if you think about what our sort of industry looks like, if you are a third-party integrator, you're a third-party technology partner, you're a systems integrator down the road, you need to be able to communicate with your customers what's going to happen. How do you plan for things? Because most customers aren't going to just upgrade every time there's an upgrade that comes from the vendor or the community. They need to be able to plan for things. So, I think communication is huge. It's huge in every community. And this is an area where, I heard from a lot of people, they're sort of going, okay, we're going to see how this evolves.
Jesse, how do you view that change, that real, let me rephrase that. How do you think about this in terms of Docker's clarity and Docker's, ability to communicate, what they are intending to do, and that as an important part of being, the steward of an open source community?
Well, I totally agree with Brian. I've heard a lot of the same talk about, wanting to understand roadmaps and being more transparent. So I think if you step back a moment and look at Docker Inc. and then the GitHub repo for Kubernetes and the CNCF, you'll see right away Docker is a private company run by people with investors, and Kubernetes is an open source project sponsored by a foundation. So there's an inherent natural conflict that is immediately apparent. Now, I think going into that decision as an enterprise with your eyes wide open and understanding the trade-offs there are what I try to coach people through in terms of what's important and what's not. I think there is an inherent conflict in a lowercase Docker, uppercase Docker world, but there's a benefit from that depending on your organizational makeup. I think there's probably there's a better way to separate out Docker the private company from Docker the project, and I hope that with the proliferation and popularity of the Kubernetes community, that will exert the pressure we need to keep Docker incorporated honest. I think the ecosystem will be much more interesting the more successful Kubernetes is. But on the other hand, I have a feeling Docker could go down the path of providing the safe, support oriented container ecosystem that doesn't need to be too ambitious for a particular company. It will be more developer focused. So it'll serve a separate niche, but the niche is self-evident in the makeup of the company and the project. And I think, if anything, I'd like to see that be made more explicit. And I can't see that happening without some more time sussing out the ecosystem and Kubernetes becoming, more entrenched and more popular, forcing then Docker to, play their hand and to say specifically, this is what we want, and we're not going to be totally open about this standard. We are going to run it faster than you can. We're going to run it, whatever the sales pitch is. And I don't have an opinion about faster or slower, but I think at some point they need to sit down and say, hey, this is what we're offering, and it's not what the other guy has.
I wonder if I used to think that Docker would want to become the VMware of the container world, much like VMware pretty much owns the virtual machine market now, or a good chunk of it. I used to figure that was their plans, but I'm wondering if they're not kind of, with the emphasis of tools, kind of more or less ending up as sort of more like a Borland software and a good provider for developer tools, but kind of outside the infrastructure market. I don't know. I'm just throwing that out there.
Well, if you look at InfraKit, which is something they announced over this past week, that is a direct output of their experience with running Docker on AWS and Docker for Azure. So I think they are a Borland software kind of company, but they definitely have aspirations to control the underlying infrastructure, supporting these cluster systems and wanting to make sure that you have a robust compute grid on which to run your platform as a service. So yeah, hard to say.
Well, we wanted to keep this conversation fairly brief because we thought it would be just good to keep it succinct. And I think we covered a good bit of ground here. So I want to thank you guys both for joining us. Unless, Brian, do you have any last thoughts that you'd like to say in response to Jesse?
No, I think, the thing I like about the show, and I like this format is, it's always good to get some different opinions from people that are in different parts of the world, or in, sort of different parts of this ecosystem. So I love hearing, Jesse talk about, look, at the end of the day, I'm trying to help people, evolve their process. I'm trying to help people fix their organization. And he's absolutely right. I mean, a lot of the focus for a lot of these customers, end customers is as difficult to sort through just how do you make your skills better? How do you make your organization more efficient than, kind of a lot of the noise in the technology channel. So this has been, super helpful for me to get a different viewpoint on stuff. And I think he was spot on with everything he said.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. I appreciate your input as well. It's always good to hear from everyone at Red Hat and the Kubernetes community. So thank you.
Well, thank you guys both for joining us. Joab, thanks for being the co-host here. And we will be back again soon to have more discussions about the container ecosystem and the container community. And I look forward to seeing you guys both at conferences coming up and otherwise. So Brian, Jesse, thanks again for joining us.
Thanks, Alex.
Thanks, Alex.
Thanks again, and I hope to see you back at the show. Bye-bye.